Now, it's important to look into the domestic policies of Oceania in George Orwell's book 1984. The government is made up of 4 ministries. These ministries consist of the Ministry of Peace, the Ministry of Plenty, the Ministry of Truth, and the Ministry of Love. These ministries operate similar to how some departments work in the United States, like the Department of Energy or the Department of Education. In both the book and in real life, these departments are created to tackle a specific task with the interest of the government in mind, but to take some of the stress off of the central government. While in real life these departments act a bit distant from the central government, the ministries in 1984 are completely controlled by the government. First is the Ministry of Peace. The purpose of the Ministry of Peace is to manage the wars with Eurasia and East Asia. Their aim is to put as many materials into the wars as possible, even to the extent as to seeing the increase in the standard of living to be a failure of the department. While something like this has never really happened in the United States, except for the government asking people to eat less rations to give to the soldiers during World War II, there's a good example that comes from China. From 1958 to 1962, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP for short, made its people give almost everything to the government to help China become an industrial power. Anything that was made of metal was required to be given to the Chinese government so that they could use those materials to make factories and goods for exporting. What ended up happening is that farmers gave up their tools for farming, which made it almost impossible for some farmers to harvest their crops. This ended up creating a famine that killed around 55 million people. The Ministry of Plenty is the second ministry we'll look at. The Ministry of Plenty is what it alludes to. It's a ministry that regulates the production of certain goods to help meet a quota every quarter. What makes this ministry so bad is that it specifically tells people to consume less rations while at the same time claiming that they have increased the amount of food produced. This is obviously a lie because the government wouldn't have to require people to eat less food if more is being produced. This ministry also runs a morale campaign by providing a lottery system. This lottery is similar to how the lottery works in real life, where you buy a lottery ticket, a portion of the money of your purchase goes into a lottery pool, and your ticket has a very low chance of having the winning numbers. What is different in 1984 is that nobody actually wins, and the Ministry of Plenty announces a fake winner. This makes it to where people think that they have a chance of becoming super rich, while in reality, it's the Ministry of Plenty and the government that is getting super rich. There are 3 good examples of governments conducting market manipulation to make it look like the market is doing better than it actually is. The first is when the US government changed how it calculates inflation. In the 1970s, inflation hit double digits due to oil prices skyrocketing. While the oil crisis was solved, the government changed how they calculated inflation in 1983. Today, people can feel how these changes have made the total inflation rate severely undercalculated. This is because the prices of food, gas, and utilities went up almost 20% during the worst period of inflation during the Biden administration, but inflation was only reported as a little over 8%. Another good example is in China. One of China's most popular markets is their housing market. A statistic to remember for later is that China's total GDP is around $17.96 trillion, according to the World Bank. According to Business Insider, China's housing market makes up around 30% of China's total GDP. That means $5.39 out of $17.96 trillion of China's GDP is from the housing market. But this isn't what makes China's housing market so controversial. What real estate investors are doing in China is building unfinished empty apartments and selling them as if they're ready for people to rent from them. In reality, nobody lives in these apartments and they stay empty forever. This is where China gets its ghost cities name from, because there are so many of these empty apartments that it looks like entire cities have been abandoned. According to Think China, about 15% of homes in China are vacant. That's about $809 billion out of the $5.39 trillion housing market. That essentially means that $809 billion in China's GDP is, in a sense, fake. And according to Fortune, the Chinese government has spent around $42 billion in the housing market itself. It means about 5.2% of all fake homes built by China are paid for by the government to make it look like the housing market is performing stronger than it actually is. And as a short cameo, according to Market Watch, the US government has spent around $8.7 billion in the stock market, artificially bumping up the real value of the stock market. The most famous ministry from 1984 is the Ministry of Truth. The ministry controls what can and cannot be put out in the media. It is also needed to be said that this ministry is the reason why all the other ministries can get away with what they do. This gives the government power to have full control over the truth. With the government having control of the truth, the real truth dies and becomes replaced by the false truth mandated by the government. Again, there's a good example of this in China. The CCP has developed the Great Firewall. The purpose of this firewall is to prevent any outside media from getting into China and any Chinese media getting out of China. The way this is enforced with CCP appointed officials is to take down any keywords, images, and videos that make the CCP look bad in any way. The most well-known example is that the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre is banned on all social media in China. What is really scary is that the United States government has tried to play into getting rid of information that makes them look bad on social media as well. According to The Hill, in a Joe Rogan interview, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, was told by the FBI to censor all posts about the Hunter Biden laptop. Well, in the article it doesn't talk about this. During this election period, the laptop was called Russian misinformation and fake by the Biden team. In reality, this laptop was real and consisted of a number of criminal acts between Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and Jim Biden that went from drug use all the way to foreign dealings. According to Backlinko, there are about 188.6 million active users on Facebook. With the United States having a population of over 385 million people, it means 48.9% of Americans were blocked from reading a story about how the politician favored to win the 2020 election had committed very shady acts that the Americans would very much want to know about before casting a ballot. And to put it into mind how crazy that is, with 188 million people not being allowed to see the story, only 158 million people voted in the 2020 election. Statistically, that means most people who voted most likely didn't know about this laptop. What is even crazier is that the government doubled down on these Orwellian acts and created the Disinformation Governance Board. The DGB Wikipedia page describes the board as so, quote, "The board's stated function was to protect national security by disseminating guidance to DHS agencies on combating misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation that threatens the security of the homeland." This is, in my opinion, one of the most dystopian organizations the United States has ever made. I remember people actually outright calling it the Ministry of Truth. At the time, I didn't even know that the book 1984 existed, so after learning about what the board was designed to do, I genuinely believe that it's called the Ministry of Truth for a short period of time. And I still call it that today because it feels like that name better represents the organization. Luckily, due to backlash, the government shut down the organization, and Nina Jankowicz stepped down as board director. I like to think a lot about the American public is blindly walking themselves into allowing the U.S. government to become an Orwellian state. But instances like this, where people get upset with the government when they try to outright control the truth, gives me hope that the American people and our democracy might actually be the reason that our government will never become Orwellian. The final ministry to focus on is the Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Love is what makes Oceania a military state. The ministry arrests and tortures to death anyone who speaks against the government. The best way they are able to keep track of their citizens is by using telescreens. These are essentially televisions with cameras and microphones implemented in them to spy on everyone. This is very similar to how the law works in countries like China and North Korea, where speaking against the government can get you jailed and even sent to concentration camps. But unlike spying with rigged televisions, the CCP can just monitor the internet to see what everyone is posting, reading, liking, and searching. In part 5, the specifics of the Ministry of Love will be looked at more thoroughly. Another thing I wanted to talk about is how love actually works in 1984. In 1984, you are not allowed to fall in love with someone because that means you'll put more faith into a significant other rather than the government. This is very similar to how love works in North Korea today. According to Project Syndicate, in North Korea, men are required to get married and have children once they become an adult. This is most likely to guarantee population growth within the nation. According to KBS World Radio, dating is heavily monitored because it could worsen discipline in school and work. Honestly, I believe that dating is to prevent people from putting too much faith in one another and making the said relationship more important than the government.